Howdy, y'all. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Kooks, Ranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lux. And this episode is the final in the unofficial trilogy that is the America trilogy. So without further ado, I couldn't even begin to tell you how I'm going to specifically classify this particular episode. It's kind of a mixed bag, a melange, but you'll see the overarching themes. But if there's one topic I had to say outweighs everything else, it's Skinwalker lore. If that gives you any incentive to stick around and listen, check it out. So yeah, without further ado, a couple other surprises in there. Let's jump on into it. Let's go! There exists in the American Southwest a wound that refuses to heal. Not a physical gash in the earth, though the canyons run deep, but a metaphysical rupture, a tear in the fabric of reality. It's been widening ever since the first European boots disturbed the soil, since the first American fort was raised on sacred ground, since the first Navajo word was spoken into a military radio and broadcast across the Pacific, like a curse in reverse, doing its worst. This is the story of what happens when an empire, having already conquered the continent through physical violence, attempts to colonize the astral plane. It's the story of the Navajo Codetalkers, not merely as heroes of cryptography, but as unwitting practitioners of weaponized linguistics, their sacred tongue extracted and repurposed by a war machine that understood the power of words it couldn't comprehend. It's the story of the Uinta Basin, where the American military-industrial complex, descended from the very cavalry that slaughtered and displaced the indigenous nations, would spend $22 million in taxpayer money attempting to reverse engineer a phenomenon that had been unleashed by their own historical atrocities. It's also the story of Arthur Rochford Manby, the English occultist who tried to build a fortress on stolen land and was consumed by the very shadows he sought to command. And it is the story of Sarah Winchester, who built a labyrinth to house the ghosts of American industrial violence, creating a funhouse mirror that reflects the true architecture of this nation's soul. This isn't a history of battles and treaties, although blood soaks every page. This is a history of frequencies, of curses that outlive their casters, of languages that refuse to be fully translated, and of the cosmic irony that occurs when the Pentagon, armed with thermal imaging and quantum sensors, etc., finds itself outmatched by entities that operate on principles of sacred absurdity. Welcome to the third chamber of the American nightmare. The founders built the grid, the ancients laid the foundation, but it was the 20th century that attempted to weaponize the haunted soil itself, and in doing so learned that some things can't be conquered, only endured. To understand the anomaly that is Skinwalker Ranch, one must first understand the Long Walk. One must understand Canyon de Chelly in 1863, when the peach trees burned. The American Civil War wasn't merely a conflict between North and South. In the Southwest, it served as cover for a campaign of ethnic cleansing waged by the United States government against the Diné, better known as the Navajo people. Colonel Christopher Kit Carson, under orders from General James Carleton, was tasked with removing the Navajo from their ancestral lands to make way for American expansion. There's going to be another Kit. He doesn't get a specific mention, but Dr. Kit Green, or Professor Kit Green, Dr. Professor Kit Green, who was instrumental in the high strangeness and anomalistic studies done by the U.S. government. But that's just a weird little synchronicity I thought I'd point out. Carson understood that conventional warfare would fail in the labyrinthian canyons and mesa tops of Navajo country. Instead, he recruited the Ute Nation, the traditional enemies of the Navajo, who had themselves suffered from DNA raids, to serve as scouts, trackers, and mercenaries in a scorched earth campaign of terror. The Utes knew the terrain, they knew the hiding places, and they had no qualms about leading the American military to the sacred peach orchards of Canyon de Chelly, orchards planted and tended by Navajo hands over generations, representing not just sustenance but spiritual continuity with the land. Carson's troops, guided by Ute knowledge, systematically cut down and burned every tree. They slaughtered livestock, destroyed hogans, and turned the verdant canyon into a charnel house of starvation and despair. Soldiers' journals from that campaign record something beyond your standard military memoir. They'd often speak of a suffocating dread that settled over the camps at night, a psychological weight that transcended the horrors of war. The sounds of axes striking wood seemed to echo longer than it should, that rhymed, as if the canyon itself were screaming. Smoke from the burning orchards didn't rise straight, but twisted into unnatural shapes, hanging low over the river like a shroud. In 1864, broken by starvation and relentless pursuit, over 8,000 Navajos surrendered. They were forced at gunpoint to march more than 300 miles in the dead of winter to Bosque Redondo, a squalid internment camp in eastern New Mexico called Huildi, meaning the place of suffering. Thousands died on the march. Thousands more would die in the 4 years of imprisonment that followed, victims of disease, famine, and despair. But history isn't merely physical. In DNA cosmology, the universe operates on the principle of hazo, harmony, balance, beauty. When that harmony is violently shattered, the rupture creates chindi, a toxic spiritual residue, negative energy that lingers and festers. The Long Walk and the Scorched Earth campaign represented not just a military defeat, but a metaphysical catastrophe. The Utes, by allying with the American invaders to destroy the Navajos' connection to their sacred lands, had violated the spiritual order of the region. According to oral traditions whispered in the decades that followed, Navajo medicine workers, practitioners of the WWII, the Anti-Inhi, probably butchering that, I apologize if so, gathered in secret during the dark nights of imprisonment. They performed rites not of healing, but of binding. They took the sacred knowledge of shape-shifting, traditionally used for spiritual warfare and protection, and twisted it into a weapon of vengeance. They programmed negative entities, the Yi Naldlushi, Skinwalkers, to migrate north into the Uinta Basin, the heart of Ute territory. The curse was specific. The Utes would never enjoy the spoils of their betrayal. The land itself would become toxic to them, infested with shape-shifting predators that would drive them mad with paranoia and fear. This is the origin story of what would later be called Skinwalker Ranch. Not a random piece of Utah real estate, but a deliberate spiritual weapon deployed in a metaphysical war, a curse that outlived the conflict that created it, a trap set by a conquered people that would eventually ensnare the very military-industrial complex that had facilitated their displacement. The irony is crushing. The United States government, having used the Utes as pawns to destroy the Navajo, would spend the next century and a half slowly pushing the Utes onto smaller and smaller reservations, ultimately concentrating them in the Uinta Basin, directly atop the cursed ground. The weapon had been pointed at the wrong target, or perhaps the right one, depending on which side of the veil one observes from. The story of Arthur Rochford Manby is the story of what happens when European occultism collides with indigenous spiritual warfare, a collision that produced one of the most gruesome, though lesser-known, unsolved mysteries in American history. That rhymes. Manby arrived in New Mexico in 1883, an English investor possessed of ambition, eccentricity, and a complete absence of moral constraint. He became obsessed with the Antonio Martinez land grant, a 61,000-acre tract of wild land in Taos that was historically a volatile borderland between Pueblo, Ute, and Apache territories. This wasn't merely real estate. It was a spiritual fault line, a place where multiple indigenous cosmologies intersected and where the violence of Spanish, Mexican, and now American colonization had accumulated like layers of scar tissue. Over 35 years, Manby built a literal empire of fraud. He used forgery, extortion, and alleged murder to swindle the native and Hispanic inhabitants of their ancestral lands. He constructed a fortress mansion in Taos, a 19-room barricaded compound where he retreated as his paranoia and megalomania spiraled into madness. Manby didn't merely just steal land. He attempted to dominate its spiritual geography. Local lore suggests he amassed a library of European occultism, alchemy, and native witchcraft. He came to believe that by occupying the land grant, he was claiming not just territory, but a personal spiritual kingdom. He allegedly formed a secret society, the United States Secret and Civil Service Society, to terrorize the local population into compliance. This wasn't a social club. It was a weaponized psychological operation, or PSYOP, if you're trying to save time. Members were bound by blood oaths and rigid hierarchies of initiation. Lower-level members had no knowledge of who commanded them from above. The left hand didn't know what the right was doing. The society's crimes were the crimes of colonialism distilled to their purest, shittiest essence. The poisoning of wells, the midnight burning of homes, the targeted assassination of those who resisted. Families who refused to sell their land found their livestock dead, their irrigation ditches contaminated with toxic chemicals, and their barns reduced to ash. Prominent lawyers who challenged Manby's fraudulent titles were shot from ambush along dark canyon trails or simply vanished into the desert overnight. Manby constructed a dark mirror of the American intelligence apparatus, a compartmentalized cell structure operating in the shadows, using terror to achieve territorial domination. But he'd made a fatal error. He'd built his fortress on land that was already claimed by older, hungrier entities. On July 3rd, 1929, Arthur Rochford Manby's empire ended. His body was discovered inside his locked, barricaded mansion in a state of grotesque decomposition. His head had been completely severed from his torso and placed in an adjacent room. The head was partially gnawed on by his own pet German shepherds. The body was wrapped in a blanket on a cot. The house was sealed from the inside. No intruder could have entered or exited. That is, perhaps, no normal human intruder. The theories proliferated. Some claimed his own inner circle had assassinated him, executing him for his instability and threatening to expose the society's crimes, the decapitation serving as a ritualistic message about broken oaths. Others suggested that he had faked his own death, murdering a transient and decapitating the corpse to prevent identification, then fleeing to Mexico or Europe. But the theory that persists in the folklore of northern New Mexico is more chilling. That a coalition of Hispanic and Native vigilantes, acting as a mirror to Manby's own secret society, had finally breached his fortress. In regional witchcraft, decapitation is a specific method to ensure a malicious sorcerer can't reincarnate to haunt the living. Manby had spent his life trying to violently possess the ancient borderlands through occult secrecy and terror. In the end, he became consumed by that same secrecy, a headless ghost story, a warning to future invaders that the land doesn't recognize paper titles or European magic. The land recognizes blood, and it demands payment. Yet, blood payment may not have settled the debt entirely. It may have only amplified the frequency. Decades after Manby's head was severed from his shoulders, a new anomaly began to vibrate through the valley. In the early 1990s, residents of Taos began reporting an inescapable low-frequency acoustic disturbance, a relentless industrial drone that bypassed microphones, acoustic sensors, and military-grade audio equipment, vibrating directly in the inner ears of a sensitive few. The Taos hum. While scientists pointed to seismic friction, acoustic ducting, or secret military ELF or extremely low-frequency transmissions, the esoteric corners of northern New Mexico whispered a different explanation. They noted that the locus of the sound vibrated straight out of the bedrock of the old Martinez land grant. In local occult lore, Manby's blood ritual didn't dissipate upon his death. It fractured the acoustic fabric of the valley itself. The hum is said to be the subterranean feedback loop of Manby's unresolved spiritual siege, the sound of an unnatural European ego trapped beneath the earth, eternally vibrating against the ancient resonance of the land that refuses to be owned. While Manby was building his fortress of paranoia in New Mexico, another monument to American violence was rising in California, a structure that would serve as a physical metaphor for the industrial guilt that funded it. Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester repeating arms fortune, inherited $20 million in a 50% stake in the company that had manufactured the gun that won the West. The Winchester Model 1873 wasn't merely a firearm, it was an engine of continental conquest, a tool of genocide that accelerated the displacement of Native Americans and standardized mechanical death across the frontier. The rifle had killed thousands, Native warriors, Civil War soldiers, frontier settlers, outlaws, and the blood money flowed endlessly into Sarah's coffers, generating approximately $1,000 a day in tax-free income. According to legend, a Boston spiritualist medium told Sarah that her family was cursed by the spirits of all those killed by the Winchester rifle. To survive, she must move west and build a house for those vengeful ghosts. The construction must never cease. If the hammers ever fell silent, she would die. In 1886, Sarah purchased an 8-room farmhouse in San Jose, California, and began a project that would consume the remaining 36 years of her life. She hired carpenters to work in rotating shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until her death in 1922. The result was a sprawling 160-room Victorian labyrinth that defies all architectural logic, a structure that grew without master blueprints, structural engineers, or any real plan other than the obsessive need to keep building. The Winchester Mystery House is saturated with high strangeness. Staircases ascend 7 steps only to terminate at solid ceilings. Doors open onto 2-story drops. A staircase with 44 steps, switchbacks repeatedly to cover a vertical rise of just 9 feet. All designed, supposedly, to accommodate Sarah's severe arthritis, but functioning as an architectural trap. Confusion of dimensions. The number 13 appears everywhere. 13 pane windows, 13 panel ceilings, 13 steps, 13 bathrooms, and 13 drain holes in sink strainers. Skylights are built into floors. Posts and pillars are installed upside down. Rooms are built only to be immediately walled over. Doors sealed and windows darkened. Before the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the house reached 7 stories. When the top floors collapsed, Sarah had them sealed off rather than rebuilt, leaving truncated hallways that lead to nowhere and structural dead ends that stand as monuments to an abrupt catastrophe. The house is a psychogeographical anomaly, a physical manifestation of a mind attempting to outrun its own ghosts. It represents the American industrial empire turned inward. Limitless capital, consumed not for any functional purpose, but for sheer desperate paranoid ritual. Just as America expanded westward without a master plan, consuming resources and territory in a frenzy of manifest destiny, Sarah's house expanded outward and upward without blueprints, consuming mahogany, stained glass, and brass to construct staircases that go nowhere and rooms that serve no purpose. It's the architectural equivalent of the military-industrial complex. Endless labor for labor's sake, growth without meaning, a fortress built to keep the past at bay while being entirely funded by that same past violence. The Winchester House stands as a funhouse mirror reflecting the American soul, a nation that built its wealth on the manufacture of death, then spent that wealth trying to build a labyrinth large enough to contain the ghosts of its own creation. By 1942, the American war machine had learned to extract more land and minerals from the indigenous populations it had conquered. It learned to extract language itself, and in doing so, unwittingly weaponized a sacred technology. The Pacific Theater of World War II presented the United States military with a crisis of communication. The Japanese had cracked every American tactical code, intercepting radio transmissions and anticipating movements with devastating effectiveness. The military needed an unbreakable cipher, a method of communication that could be transmitted rapidly over radio but remain completely indecipherable to enemy intelligence. Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who had grown up on the Navajo reservation, proposed a solution, using the Navajo language Dine Bazad as the basis for military communications. It was a perfect cryptographic candidate, an unwritten tonal language with complex grammar, completely unrelated to any European or Asian language, spoken by a population that had been systematically oppressed by the very government now asking for their help. The Marine Corps recruited the first 29 Navajo Marines, the original 29 they were called, to develop the code at Camp Pendleton. They created a 2-layer cryptographic system. First, they assigned Navajo words to military terms. Genie, or hawk, became a dive bomber. Chedagahi, or tortoise, became a tank. Dibe, or sheep, became a ship. Second, for words that needed spelling out, they developed a Navajo phonetic alphabet. But this wasn't merely translation. This was the weaponization of a sacred tongue. In traditional Navajo cosmology, language isn't merely a tool for communication. It's a technology of harmony, a method for maintaining hazo. Words have power, names have power, and to speak is to invoke. The Codetalkers weren't just translating military orders. They were broadcasting the spiritual resonance of the American Southwest across the Pacific Theater. Esoteric researchers have noted that every time a code talker spoke into a radio transceiver, they were activating individual points across an exclusive psychic network. They were taking a language that had evolved from the Red Canyons, desert winds, and specific electromagnetic environment of the Four Corners region and transmitting it into the tropical volcanic islands of the Pacific. They were, in effect, introducing an alien psychogeographic frequency into a foreign energetic landscape, a spiritual displacement where the raw ancient power of the American desert was forcefully stamped onto the Pacific theater. The results were tactically devastating to the Japanese. At Iwo Jima, 6 code talkers transmitted over 800 error-free messages in the first 48 hours alone. Major Howard Connor famously stated, quote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima," unquote. But there was a darker side to this operation. Because the code existed entirely in the minds of the code talkers, only memorized, never written, the military couldn't risk capture. Code talkers were assigned personal Marine bodyguards. Officially, these guards were for protection against friendly fire. The code talkers were frequently mistaken for Japanese soldiers by other Marines. But Chester Nez, one of the original 29, confirmed in his autobiography that the guards had covert orders. If capture was imminent, they were ordered to execute the code talker to protect the integrity of the code. The United States government had treated the Navajo language exactly as occultists treat a magical ritual, highly classified, restricted to initiates, requiring absolute precision, and possessing the power to shatter reality. They created a linguistic egregore, a collective thought form built from the focused willpower and sacred knowledge of a specific group deployed as a weapon of war. The irony is cosmic. For decades, the American government had attempted to eradicate native languages through forced assimilation and boarding schools, punishing children for speaking their ancestral tongues. Now, that same forbidden culture possessed the exact psychological weapon needed to win a world war. The language they tried to destroy became the key to their military dominance. And like all magic, there was a price. Before shipping out, many code talkers underwent intense protective ceremonies, the enemy way, or blessing way, led by medicine men to shield their spirits from the chindi, the toxic spiritual residue of death and warfare that they would encounter. Non-Navajo Marines frequently noted that the code talkers seemed to possess an uncanny evasion ability on the battlefield, bullets and shrapnel tearing through camps while leaving them untouched, as if the language itself acted as a physical shield. But the spiritual contamination couldn't be entirely avoided. The Code Talker program remained classified until 1968. For nearly 3 decades, the veterans couldn't share their experiences with their families, their medicine men, or their communities. In esoteric terms, this enforced silence created a psychic vacuum, a massive accumulation of unresolved spiritual energy that couldn't be cleansed or dissolved through traditional ceremony. When the program was finally declassified, this accumulated energy leaked into the American collective subconscious, feeding directly into the modern obsession with government cover-ups, skinwalkers, and the high strangeness of the American West. The curse that the Navajo medicine workers allegedly unleashed upon the Uinta Basin in the 1860s didn't dissipate. It festered. It waited. And in the 1990s, it would draw the American military-industrial complex into a confrontation that would expose the fundamental inadequacy of their empirical materialist worldview. Skinwalker Ranch, located in Utah's Uinta Basin, historically considered to be Ute territory, had long been a place of anomalous activity. Local Ute elders warned that the land was cursed by Navajo sorcerers, infested with shape-shifting entities that could mimic human voices, appear as unnatural animals, and induce madness in those who trespassed. The phenomenon reported at the ranch read like a catalog of high strangeness. Massive wolves that couldn't be killed by gunfire, cattle mutilations done with surgical precision, invisible entities that would shake trailers and attack researchers, anomalous radio frequency spikes, and orbs of light that seemed to possess intelligent behavior. In 1996, billionaire Robert Bigelow purchased the property and established the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, to study the phenomena scientifically. This was followed in the 2000s by the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, or AWSAP, which spent $22 million in taxpayer money attempting to understand what was happening at the ranch. The irony is almost too perfect to be believed. The United States military, descended from the same cavalry that had forced the Navajo on the Long Walk and displaced the Utes onto reservations, was now spending millions to scientifically dissect a supernatural weapon that, according to regional folklore, the Navajo had deployed against the Utes for their betrayal during the very same historical conflict. The government had weaponized the Navajo people to defeat the Japanese Empire in the 1940s, and now they were trying to weaponize, or at the very least understand, the supernatural fallout of their own historical atrocities. But the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch doesn't behave like a physical object to be studied. More like a trickster, an anti-structural intelligence that mocks human certainty and eludes rigid categorization. When scientists brought out their million-dollar sensor arrays, the phenomenon often ceased, only to reappear when the equipment was turned off. When high-powered lasers were fired into the sky, the beams were swallowed, or anomalous RF signals were projected that mocked the equipment. Researchers experienced the hitchhiker effect, where paranormal activity would follow them home to their suburban families, suggesting the phenomena wasn't localized but relational, relative, and responsive to observation. The entities displayed behaviors that violated materialist physics, creatures that could change form in seconds, orbs that could pass through solid matter, voices that mimicked loved ones with perfect accuracy to lure victims into danger. This wasn't the behavior of undiscovered animals or advanced technology. This was the behavior of a consciousness that operated on principles of sacred absurdity. The military intelligence apparatus approached the ranch as they would approach a foreign military installation. They wanted to map the parameters, find vulnerabilities, reverse engineer technology, and weaponize what they found. They brought spreadsheets, thermal cameras, and rigid protocols to a confrontation with entities that operated on dream logic and paradox. They were essentially trying to capture a cloud with a net, or bringing a spreadsheet to an avant-garde theater performance. The indigenous understanding of such phenomena, whether the Navajo Yi Naudlushi or the Ute bear dance traditions, recognizes that these forces couldn't be conquered or colonized. They could only be respected, warded against through specific rituals, or endured. The Ute bear dance, one of their oldest ceremonies, was specifically designed to create spiritual shields against witchcraft. The Navajo avoided speaking of skinwalkers aloud, believing that naming them drew their attention. But the American government couldn't accept, let alone fully conceive, this particular paradigm. They couldn't accept that there were things on the continent that they had conquered that remained beyond their control, beyond their understanding, and remained fundamentally hostile to their presence. They couldn't accept that the land itself might reject their empirical frameworks. The result was a multi-million-dollar exercise in futility, one funded by you, the taxpayers. The phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch remains as elusive and terrifying as ever. Periodically erupting into violence that can't be predicted or prevented, the military-industrial complex had met its match, not in a foreign power, but in the accumulated spiritual karma of American history, a curse that had been waiting for them since the Long Walk. To understand why the American military intelligence apparatus must fail in its attempts to colonize the supernatural, one must understand the archetype of the trickster and its human counterpart, the sacred clown. In Lakota cosmology, the Heyoka is the sacred clown, a person who's received a vision of the thunder beings and is compelled to live in opposition to normal reality. They ride horses backwards, wear coats in the summer and nothing in the winter. They say goodbye when they arrive and hello when they leave. They am bizarro. Their purpose is to act as a living mirror to the community, puncturing human arrogance and rigid thinking through absurdity. They're the only members of the tribe permitted to mock the powerful without consequence. The trickster archetype, coyote, iktomi, or raven, functions similarly on a cosmic scale. It's the boundary crosser, the habitual line stepper, the disruptor of rigid order, and a reminder that the universe is fluid, alive, and fundamentally nonlinear. It exists to mock human certainty and demonstrate that reality isn't the solid, predictable mechanism that empiricists would have you believe it to be. The phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch and the broader category of high strangeness that permeates the American landscape operates on trickster principles. It's explicitly anti-structural. It appears when scientific protocols are abandoned and disappears when rigid measurements are applied. It leaves calling cards that seem designed to be unrepeatable, like dead animals arranged in impossible geometries, voices on encrypted frequencies that speak in riddles, or entities that can be seen but not photographed. The Pentagon sends military intelligence officers, data analysts, and rigid materialist scientists to study these phenomena. They send the absolute antithesis of the sacred clown. They send people without the sixth sense, that of humor, who can't laugh at themselves, who can't accept paradox, and who require quantifiable data and repeatable results. They approach the trickster as a conundrum to be conquered rather than as an intelligence to be engaged. Now, I know that doesn't go for all of them. Like a couple guys like Eric Davis seem pretty cool. They seem pretty on the level. But I'm speaking in generalities here. The trickster doesn't negotiate with empires. It mocks them. When SUP researchers attempted to establish control over the ranch, the phenomena responded by infiltrating their personal lives, following them home, and turning their suburban homes into extensions of a haunted territory. The phenomenon wasn't a localized object to be contained. It was a relational intelligence that responded to the researchers' presence with hostility and absurdity. The indigenous approach to such forces recognized that you can't fight or categorize cosmic chaos. You must create a structured space within your culture to honor it. You must build a place for the clown, or the trickster will tear your house down. That rhymed. In order to make one. The Ute used bear medicine. The Navajo maintained strict taboos. They understand that these entities haunting the borders of human settlements would never yield to their demands or attempts at weaponization. They could only be kept at bay through humility, ritual, and the recognition that some things are beyond human control. The American Empire, built on the principle of manifest destiny and the extraction of resources, can't or won't accept this. It can't accept that there are things on this continent that can't be used, patented, or weaponized. It can't accept that the land itself might possess an intelligence that rejects the colonial project. And so it continues to throw money and technology at the problem, continuing to lose a game it doesn't even realize it's playing. We arrive now at our synthesis, the terrible convergence of these threads that reveals the true architecture of the American experiment. The United States was founded by men who believed they could use sacred geometry and esoteric knowledge to build a rational utopia, a new Atlantis that would reflect cosmic order on Earth. They built grids, laid out cities according to celestial alignments, and established a republic that they viewed as a magical working. But they built this enlightened matrix on a foundation of slavery, genocide, and the violent displacement of indigenous nations whose understanding of the land's spiritual geography they dismissed as primitive superstition. The 19th century saw the expansion of that empire across the continent, the gun that won the West, producing the wealth that built the Winchester Labyrinth while simultaneously generating the ghosts that would haunt it. The scorched earth campaigns against the Navajo and the Utes created not just historical trauma, but metaphysical ruptures, curses that would outlive their casters and eventually draw the military-industrial complex into a confrontation it could not and will not win. The 20th century saw the weaponization of indigenous sacred knowledge. The Codetalkers' language turned into a cryptographic weapon, their spiritual protections strained by the enforced silence of classification. And it saw the attempts to colonize the astral plane itself. The Pentagon's millions spent trying to understand Skinwalker Ranch, trying to extract the technology of shapeshifting and anomalous phenomena, trying to apply the logic of military intelligence to entities that operate on dream logic. The loop is closed. The empire that began by trying to eradicate native languages ended up dependent on them for military victory. The empire that displaced the Utes onto cursed land ended up spending millions to investigate that very curse. The empire that built its wealth on the Winchester rifle ended up funding the labyrinthian house that would contain the ghosts of that violence. And throughout it all, the trickster watches. The Skinwalker, whether as a literal entity or as a metaphor for the land's rejection of colonial control, continues to elude, mock, and terrorize those who would seek to weaponize the sacred. The military-industrial complex, with all its sensors and classifications, finds itself outmatched by phenomena that refuse to be quantified. Just as the colonial project has always been outmatched by the spiritual complexity of the land it sought to conquer. The American project has always been an attempt to impose order onto chaos, grid lines over wilderness, and rationality onto mystery. But the land remembers. The caves breathe, the mounds watch, and the entities that have always lived here, whether as literal monsters or as the accumulated weight of historical trauma made manifest, continue to operate on their own terms, indifferent to the Empire's attempts at comprehension or control. The Winchester Mystery House stands today as a tourist attraction. Its staircases to nowhere, stocked by thousands of visitors each year. Skinwalker Ranch is now the subject of reality television, its phenomena packaged for entertainment. The Codetalkers have been honored with medals and movies, their stories sanitized for patriotic consumption. Arthur Manby's headless ghost is just another regional legend, a spooky story told to tourists with tinnitus and Taos. Whew. First try, got it. But the underlying reality remains. The curse persists. The phenomenon continues. The military-industrial complex continues to probe the boundaries of the unknown, still trying to extract the whole buffalo, use every part of the indigenous experience for colonial profit and military advantage. The empire never ended. It simply digitized itself, evolved, and continued its attempts to colonize not just the physical continent, but the metaphysical one as well. Don't even get me started on the DMT rebreathers fitted for soldiers. I don't know if these were true things that I stumbled across. If I could find that site again, I would plaster it everywhere. Anyways, it continues to believe that if it throws enough money, enough technology, and enough black budget secrecy at the sky will eventually surrender its secrets. But the trickster remains. The skinwalker awaits. The language refuses full translation, and the land, ancient, haunted, and profoundly alive, continues to reject the invader's paradigm, proving that some things will always remain beyond the reach of empire, existing in the spaces where the grid fails, the sensors malfunction, and the rational mind must one day finally admit that it's indeed not the master of all it surveys. Chaos always creeps in. The construction never stops. The labyrinth grows larger, and the ghosts of the Winchester rifle, the long walk, and the cursed Uinta Basin continue to accumulate, waiting for the moment when the veil finally tears, when the South Star climbs, and when the empire that tried to contain them finally collapses under the weight of its own extraction. Welcome to the end of the Fourth World. The Code Talker spoke, the Skinwalkers listened, and the bill is coming due any day now. That's the end of the American Nightmare Trilogy. I've got a sort of very loosely related extra episode that is sort of, well, loosely affiliated with this. It's going to look at a certain specific area, very specific area of highly American folklore. A certain folklore that exists elsewhere, but it's very entrenched into the American identity. Just all I'll say is the road, the road, the road. And leave it at that. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope to see you on the next one, where we once again traverse the layers of deep weirdness and the peaks of high strangeness and the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. Love you guys. Love yourselves. Love each other. Take care of each other, because we're all we got. And I will see you on the next one. Peace out.
No, man, nothing is fucked here.
Nothing is fucked!
No, man.
The goddamn plane has crashed into the